What's up, everyone? Welcome to The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. Liberty Bill is my hero name, by the way. I don't divulge my secret identity on YouTube, but I do encourage everybody who chooses to follow the path of the hero to choose a hero name. One, it's a lot of fun to figure out something that works for you. And two, it really, honest to goodness, makes a difference moment to moment to have a hero name and a hero persona that you can summon to mind in moments of decision to remind yourself, hey, you're a hero. You follow the 3 simple rules of heroism. You don't throw the first punch. You get stronger every day, and you at least help people when it's easy. So I encourage choosing a hero name. And then a couple of bookkeeping notes. I mentioned in the last video that I was going to start this off with like a 7-part series to explain the 3 principles and the 3 strategies. And putting this together, I realized that that's just not going to work. This stuff is like way too long and complicated to break it down simply into just 7 videos. I don't want these videos to be really long. This isn't an epistemology course or anything. So for a 10 or 15 minute video, I'm not going to be able to get it all done in a 7-part series. So I'm going to be putting these out in, multiple videos going forward, but I also don't want this to be like super dry and boring. So I'm also going to mix it up as we go along with funner stuff. So just bear with me. I promise I will get the entire argumentation out for the philosophy, very soon, but it's not going to be the 7-part series like I originally had envisioned. So that said, let's jump into the introduction to the first pillar of truth. We're going to be looking at a few things about epistemology. And, don't get scared. Again, this isn't going to be a course. I'm just going to briefly explain where I'm coming from and what the framework of my arguments is going to be. Largely for bookkeeping purposes, I want it in my library. So 100 videos down the road, if somebody makes some like extremely elementary objection, I can be like, dude, watch the epistemology video, number 2, and then I can be done with it. So I am going to explain some very important things, though, going forward that I encourage you to watch if you want to fully understand the philosophy, because if you skip steps, you're gonna have some questions. So let's try not to skip steps. So I put some slides on the screen, or a slide to start us off. Just to give you a visual reference to what I'm talking about. So from a very general perspective, I only deal with rationalism in the blue triangle. I don't deal with the subjective or the romanticism on this channel, which are represented in the red triangles. First of all, the subjective, those are opinions, those are values and preferences. And from an ethics perspective, those are unmeasurable, they are irrelevant. And they, to me, fall into the realm of metaphysics, which I don't find to be relevant to the investigation of ethics. I think that the definition of ethics, or argue that the definition of ethics, is about human beings, people or egos that are teleological and make choices, and their perceptions. So regardless of whether the universe is exactly as we perceive it to be, versus us just being brains in a vat living in a matrix, it doesn't really matter from the perspective of ethics. So metaphysics isn't really something that I like to deal with. Epistemology is something that we need to deal with. So in terms of romanticism and rationalism, these two just do their dance throughout all of human history. They create the kyklos, which is what Plato called it, the cycle of empire. And what happens is that rationals build a society, but over time the elites hoard the power, which creates a romantic movement. And then the romantics kind of destroy the society, and then the rationals rebuild it, and the whole cycle starts again. And we are in the end phases of a cycle. So romanticism has really come to the fore. And romanticism is hallmarked by polylogism, as Mises called it. The idea that different groups have different logics that apply to them. For example, through the works of Rousseau, Marx, or Mao Zedong. And in the most modern iterations, it takes the form of postmodernism, critical race theory, and is all based on a value-driven analysis. And we don't do that here. I am a rationalist. We presume that there is a universal logic and that empiricism is the same for everybody, and that, the Pythagorean theorem and iPhones work for everybody. I come from the tradition of Locke and Mises and Popper, and I use the methods of praxeology and critical rationalism, and I strive to create a value-free analysis, a Wert-free analysis, as Mises called it. So I am not really going to even address the subjective or romanticism or critical race theory or anything like that. I think that it's pretty silly, just as polylogism doesn't make sense when you're talking about the bourgeois versus the proletariat, or the Christians versus the Jews, right? The logic is the same for everybody. When somebody rolls out an iPhone that works on different logic and stuff, then maybe I'll listen to it. But we know that's never going to happen because it's just silly. And even though we're in a romantic age and critical race theory is taken seriously in some venues, it's not taken seriously here. The heroic ethic is a rational philosophy. So now, having established that, let's look a little bit closer at truth, because there are three dominant, theories of truth, so to speak: the coherence theory of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, and the pragmatic theory of truth. And guess what? They're all true. They're all valid. The thing is that they all approach truth from a different direction, which is why I think the triangle here is an elegant visual representation of truth. And the reason that we have three of them is that we need three of them, because all of them are limited in certain ways and require certain criteria to be met. And while we might prefer to use one over the other, sometimes we can't because the necessary criteria aren't in place. So first, coherence. That is the logical school of deduction, and it demands consistency with logic, and it demands consistency with a proposition's own inferences. It has to be internally consistent. And truths derived from deduction are universal truths. And it is from this method that I derive the three principles upon which the heroic ethic is based. And examples of these sorts of universal truths are those that are found in mathematics, in praxeology, or in ethics, as I argue. So again, these truths are universal. There are never any outliers to the Pythagorean theorem. There are never any outliers to the laws of margin utility or the laws of supply and demand. And there are no outliers when it comes to, in my argument, rape, murder, and theft being a bad thing. Now, the weakness of the deductive method is that it does require sound premises, and premises themselves are subject to the correspondence and pragmatic methods, as I'll discuss in a minute. But we should point out that some truths are self-evident. For example, cogito ergo sum, or the fact that humans have the perception of free will. These sorts of truths cannot be denied without immediately entering into a logical contradiction. And so we can actually use those as premises for deduction to create universal truths that will ultimately become the three principles of the heroic ethic. In contrast, correspondence is induction versus deduction, essentially the scientific method or empiricism. And it also demands consistency with logic. Everything with a real existence demands consistency with logic. But it also demands consistency with empirical evidence. Recall that empirical evidence had no bearing on deductive truths. You can bring a briefcase full of evidence against the Pythagorean theorem, and I don't even need to look at it, because evidence doesn't apply in that case. But it is certainly important in induction, and induction only results in provisional truths. What's basically happening is that we don't know any premises like we do with deduction and certain self-evident premises, but we can see the results. So what we do is we examine the results and try to tease out the premises. But we can never do so for sure. They are only provisional. Any empirical proposition can be overturned on future evidence. For example, Newton's laws were overturned by Einstein's laws. Yet induction is extremely powerful and a fantastic means of acquiring knowledge in physics, in chemistry, in engineering. But the weakness of it is that it requires measurable, constant, and controllable variables. If you don't have those things, you can't use empiricism. And in fact, as a tangent, I argue that one of the great problems of the age is that we attempt to apply this methodology to subject matter which is inappropriate for it, specifically human beings and the social sciences. Human beings do not have measurable variables. Those variables are not constant, and you can't control them in a laboratory to eliminate the influence of uninteresting variables. And I think the desire to pretend that economics and sociology and various other social sciences are hard sciences has been a huge mistake that has led to more falsehood than truth. And I back that up with the replicability crisis that we are currently undergoing in our modern age. So I don't use correspondence much in my arguments. However, some truths are obvious. For example, goods are heterogeneous, right? This is not a deductive truth. There's no reason logically that there can't be one homogeneous good out there that we're all a part of and such, but it is silly, right? Because to the most casual glance, there is more than one sort of good. Goods are heterogeneous. So when I do make use of inductive truths and empirical truths, I tend to do so, or I strive to do so, and I believe have successfully always done so, only use those sorts of empirical truths that are extremely obvious. I'm only going to be saying things like time is scarce and leisure is preferred to labor and goods are heterogeneous, etc. Things that are obviously true, even though they come from the inductive empirical method. And it is from pragmatism that we gain the other half of the philosophy. We derive our principles from deduction, but we will derive our strategies from abduction. The pragmatic theory of truth must, of course, be consistent with logic. It must also be consistent with all known empiricism. But the problem is that we employ it when we can't use deduction or induction because we don't have sound premises and we don't have measurable, constant, or controllable variables. This creates heuristics that humans use to stack the odds in their favor. The litmus test of which is its consistency with successful action. A good heuristic results in successful action. And pragmatic truths are only suspected. We don't know for sure if they're true, and we are using a type of Bayesian probability to reach the best heuristics. And this is from where I create the strategies that are assigned to the other pillars of justice, power, and benevolence. Because pragmatic truths employ heuristics, they are based on distributions, which means that there are outliers, and there are no obvious truths. For example, in seduction, in entrepreneurship, in sales, in social sciences, these things are so complex that we can't measure them. They're not constant anyway. We don't have any sound premises to build on. So we create distributions and outliers and general rules and heuristics, but no truths are obvious. So keep these three approaches to truth in mind, because I'm going to employ them at various times throughout my argumentation. And it's important to know these things because when it comes to trying to falsify a particular proposition, you have to understand which of these methods is being used. If you are trying to attack a deductive argument, for example, the law of the Pythagorean theorem, you can't come to it with evidence. You have to either disprove the inferences or the soundness of the premises. Now, to a degree, some premises do call for empirical verification, which is why I don't completely discount correspondence and empiricism. I do use it to some degree. And when I am making arguments that are in the empirical realm, then they can only be falsified through evidence and such, right? And then when I am making claims that are pragmatic and based on distributions and outliers, I'm going to have to be very careful because I don't want to make claims that are on the borderline, that are equivocal. I only want to make very strong claims as I'm putting together my strategies. So that's it, a very brief introduction to the epistemology that I'm going to be using as I construct my arguments going forward. Hope it wasn't too boring for you. Please let me know if you have any questions or arguments against in the comments. And keep in mind, guys, it's a short video. I understand that I am greatly simplifying things here and skipping a lot of stuff. And if you're really interested, get a textbook on epistemology or take a course in epistemology. You can learn all about verificationism and justificationism and falsification and all that stuff. But this is how I'm going to be approaching and creating my arguments going forward. And I'm going to be referencing this a few times, I think, going forward as well. So just something to keep in mind. In any case, thanks so much for watching. This has been The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. I will see you next time when I talk about nihilism.